Dobrý večer, milí diváci, divačky. Vítám vás v kempu na Urban Talks. Jmenuji se Rozálie Kašparová, jsem architektka, urbanistka a dnešní večer bude v angličtině, takže odteď budu mluvit anglicky. Hello everyone here and also online. Welcome to Urban Talks, which is a thing that we invite foreign guests, architects, urbanists, and people who design cities to camp. And today we have a great guest. I think you have really lots to look forward to. We will have a discussion after the lecture. You can send your questions to Slido, which you can find online, and the hashtag is Urban Talks. So you can save your questions there, or you can save it to your mind, and later we'll have microphones among you, and you can ask questions right here as well. Today we're going to introduce you great architect and urbanist Vishaan Chakrabarti, and he served under the mayor Michael Bloomberg in New York, helped to create Highline, Columbia campus expansion, incorporate the new street grid around the World Trade Center, and my favorite, rebuild of the East River waterfront, especially Domino Park. And he's going to be talking about architecture in urbanity. I'm not going to dig much into the lecture because you're going to hear it yourself. But 8 years ago, Vishaan founded Studio PAU, which is a practice of architecture and urbanism. They call themselves a social impact studio, and they design innovative yet practical and vibrant creative environments and resilient cross-culture urban patterns, and that every person can experience every day. Thank you for your patience, and Vishaan, come please to the stage. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome to Prague.
Thank you. It's
I
lovely
heard
to be here.
you were walking today in Prague. How did you like it?
We walked all 57 neighborhoods, I think. I loved it. I loved it. We got a little out of the historic core and saw, I think, where a lot of real people live, and it was very interesting.
I hope you didn't went to Koloděje or Klanovice, but what was your favorite part of the day?
I think going to the top of the TV tower. So I'm with my wife, who is also an architect, Maria, and we just really, the building is extraordinary, and it was really amazing to be up there and see all of Prague. Yeah, that's very great. That's our very famous yet controversial architecture. Not everybody loves it, but I learned to love it. Yeah, architects usually do. Yeah.
Okay, take your microphone, and the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for letting me into this extraordinary place. We've experienced such great hospitality here. The last time I was in Prague was, I think, in 1985, and a lot has changed since then. But I'm very jealous of this space. We need something like this in New York. And I know this is a place for architects because I noticed the children are only allowed to play with white Legos, right? There are no colors, please. And so, tomorrow, we're actually going to Brno, and we're going to go see the Tugendhat House. And that reminds me of a famous Mies van der Rohe quote. He said, "Architecture is the will of the epoch translated into space." The epoch means the era. You know, it is basically a kind of mirror and a window into what drives society, I think, is what he was trying to say. And so I think about what drives society and drives an architect to try to have social impact in our world today. And obviously the world's a very complicated place. There's 2 wars going on. It's a hard place to understand. I think there's this larger context. Oh, something happened. It all went green. We're going to continue. That's a hurricane. It looks good on my screen. And then, you know, so climate change, obviously, driving driving a tremendous amount of this. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. So what's the context under which we are practicing? And I don't mean to be architects, landscape architects, urban planners. What is the context under which we're practicing? I would still argue that the major challenge we face is climate change. We face that as a species. But then other factors start getting involved. Inequality. This is a map of actually the racial income gap in the United States, but it could actually be a reflection of inequality that kind of manifests in all sorts of ways across the country and the world. And then technology. This is the famous I from HAL from 2001. Some of you might recognize it. But you know, that fear of technology, the idea of what is AI going to do to our world. But even more recently, technology in terms of the pandemic, and understanding that it created all sorts of mental health issues and loneliness issues that we're still struggling with, especially young people today are struggling with. And so I want to get back to that. So what's interesting is, as you sit there and talk about loneliness at one level, you have a world that by the end of this century will probably reach about 10 billion people, and we will probably hit peak population and go from about 8 to 10 billion people, according to the United Nations, towards the end of this century. And then population will start to decrease slowly. But still, we have another 2 billion people to figure out how to house and feed, right? So all of these conditions, climate change, inequity, technology, mental health and social health, and then population change. And I think that is the context that we practice under. So let's start with that population figure for a second, because it's one, I find that especially in Western society, that population graph really scares people. So what's interesting is this is showing you where the population is growing and where the population is projected to grow. And of course, the blue is where you start, you're having negative birth rates, right? But the most intensive population growth in sub-Saharan Africa and some other countries in the world. But what's interesting is that's not what's driving climate change, and people think it is what is driving climate change. What's driving climate change are the countries that have the most carbon emissions per capita, right? And so you see these these maps are almost opposites of each other, right? In the sense that this is telling you actually that the places that have the lowest birth rates are often using the most amount of carbon because of lifestyle and the way we live. And if you take a more granular look, this is from a data scientist at Berkeley in the United States. So this is the East Coast of America, obviously. You see New York, you see Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. What you notice is something very interesting, is that the carbon emissions per capita is very similar in the city as it is to the rural area. Now, this might be very, very different here in the Czech Republic, but in the United States, we have this very severe problem now, which is since World War II, we've been incentivizing people to live in those red zones called the suburbs. And you see how high that carbon emissions per capita is in those suburbs, mainly because of a very intensive use of cars, houses, landscaping, which has a strangely very dramatic impact. And so clearly and these are actually 6 suburban developments from 6 continents around the world. So what happened is, after World War II, the United States kind of set up an idea for people that if you were successful, if you had made it, right, that this is how you were to live. And they called it the American dream. And that spread all over the world to the extent that many people, and about 2 billion people have entered the middle class since the 1990s, right, have desired this lifestyle as a symbol of success. But you can understand, and as architects and urbanists, I'm sure you understand, that this is an enormous problem in terms of the resources of the planet. It's also a social problem, it's an inequity problem, it's all of those other things that I started the lecture with. So this is really a difficult challenge, that billions of people are choosing to live this way. But perhaps they're choosing to live this way because this is also a problem. Our cities are growing in a way that's not very good. These are 6 housing complexes, again from 6 continents all over the world, where especially a global development industry has decided that the way to build housing in cities is to use a very, very cookie cutter, I don't know if you use this term here, this very generic way of building the same housing complex in the same place, to the extent where people, when they travel, they sometimes lose all sight of where they are, and that we feel that we're losing cultural identity because our buildings are becoming so similar. These are also, interestingly, in many cities, and I'll talk a lot about this, in terms of affordability, becoming a huge challenge. And I know I've heard a lot that this is a problem in Prague, that people have trouble affording housing in the city. And so we have these two kind of poles in which people are trying to figure out how to live. And a lot of the problems with this is driving this, because people are saying that's cheaper, I have more space, even if I have to drive my car into the city every day, I'd prefer to live this way with my family. So if we don't fix this, we can't fix that. So the thing is, then what is urbanity? Urbanity, if it wasn't those towers I was just showing you, what is it? The interesting thing is, you know, and we just had the ultimate test of this with the pandemic, where technologists and economists have been saying for a long time, if we just had the technology, people thought when the telephone was invented that we would stop living in cities. And yet, it's who we are culturally. Since the beginning, really, of Homo sapien culture, we have been building collective environments, often for spiritual and cultural reasons, not just economic reasons, not just for trade. This has tended to be who we are, and then you can map through civilization across almost every continent the way in which we built cities over time and built collective environments. And the fact that we just went through a pandemic, and yet we're all here on a Friday night at 7 o'clock when it's cold outside, right? Because we actually enjoy a collective experience together, right? So if that's who we are culturally, I've never worked on a screen like this, so I'm going to get a little confused about which slide is where. We then need to think about, well, what is this urbanity thing? And I have a specific definition. I have a book coming out later this year that talks about this called The Architecture of Urbanity. And I think people think that urbanity is about big. It's about big cities. And I don't agree with that. I think that there is a way in which a large metropolis can be very urbane and very mixed culturally and socially, or it can be very segregated, like the upper left. A small village can be quite segregated, or it can be quite mixed, and therefore have certain urban characteristics. I've been to farming villages in Tokyo that are actually very, very urbane in a certain way. And so I'm trying to use this word in a different way. And so what are the ingredients? This comes from a Greek city planner named Konstantin Doxiadis. He wrote this series of books called Acoustics, very interesting. And he had this idea that in cities, or even in small villages, that every once in a while someone was born who thought differently than the people around them. They felt alienated in this small place where they lived, and so they started going to denser and denser environments until they finally met people who thought differently like them. These are the artists, the weirdos, the geeks, the musicians, the architects, the people who just think maybe the world should be different. And his idea of urbanity was that if those people then met in a place like this, that they would spread ideas, and those ideas would change the world. In some ways, this is a diagram of things like the Arab Spring or other revolutions where you understand that, and this city certainly understands this concept, that cities and collective environments are very important for social change because of that density, because of that social connection. And so what do architects and urbanists have to do with that? I believe we can encourage this in what we design, right? So whether it's architects, landscape architects, urbanists, that we can do something called connective design, which is, I think of it as everything as expansive as a master plan that connects people in public space to where you place a door in a building. That all of those things connect people or disconnect people, depending on the design decisions that are made. That then spurs this sense of urbanity. And I think if that sense is held up in the places that we build and grow, that we can create a sense of place, we can create a sense of pluralism in terms of diversity, and that we can actually create a better planet in terms of environment. So, oops, sorry, I keep doing this. My team did this to me on purpose. They said, Vishaan, if you go left to right, then you can go right to left, and I'm not that smart. So if you build those places that I was just talking about, this is actually a diagram from the United States Surgeon General, meaning the kind of head of the medical authorities in the United States. And there's increasing research in the public health field that this idea of social connection, this idea that I'm calling urbanity, is actually extremely good in helping these public health problems that we're seeing in terms of the loneliness that I talked about at the beginning, right? That in terms of biology, our physiology, that our health is actually impacted by the number of social connections we have. And so I actually believe that there is, we talk about climate and these very, very large issues, but this is a very personal issue about how we interact with people and whether we can build environments that create more health. And so to do that, I think we can create the things that advance social connection. And I call that an infrastructure of opportunity. What I mean by that is everything from public housing and social housing to green space, to public health care, walkability, accessibility, and so forth. And what that leads to is this idea of not just an economy, but an idea of, and not just jobs, because again, in a post-pandemic circumstance, when people have much, much more option in terms of where they work and how they work, to create more total environments, I think we need to have a sense of jobs as well as a sense of justice in our environment, that our environments are equitable for people, and that they also create a sense of joy. And that, I think, comes from this idea of social connection. So what I now want to do is give you a few case studies of this idea from our work. Some of it is architecture work. Some of it is actually research that we do in our studio. So the first is this thing we call interoculus. This is our firm won a prize called the Miller Prize. This is in a very small town in Indiana, in the middle of the country, a very interesting, very diverse city. And so the first thing we did, so the idea, if you win the Miller Prize, it's a funny thing. They call you, they tell you you've won this prize, they give you a certain amount of money, and they ask you to build an intervention in the city. And then the first thing we then do is we go to the city, and there's a public outreach component that's very significant, that includes both, public meetings, eating ice cream, and then meeting with students on Zoom and so forth. And we learned a lot about what people wanted in the city in terms of a public intervention. And what's interesting about this city is this little city in Indiana has some of the most extraordinary array of work of modern architects from the 20th century that you will see. So there's work from both the Elder Saarinen and Eero Saarinen, I.M. Pei, all because one of the corporate leaders of the town was also a big architecture fan, hired Saarinen to design his house. And so the town, and again, it's a town of about 55,000 people, it's quite small, has amazing, amazing architecture, but actually not very much public space. It has a nice park, but there's no kind of public gathering space. And when we did our public outreach, when we did all the meetings and so forth, we kept hearing from people that there's really no place. And we heard from a lot of teenagers, again, who are coming out of the pandemic, right, and are looking for that social connection, that there's no place to hang out in the city. And so we became very interested in the center. This is the main intersection in the city. And we called it the omphalos. That's a Greek word for the belly button, the navel of the city. And we said we could really build something that was very interesting there. And so one of the things we know about this intersection is there already were a lot of festivals where they would close down the street in this intersection. And actually, it's quite a diverse community. And so different ethnic festivals would happen there. So we already knew there was that tradition. So we started doing what architects do. We started looking at what precedents might be interesting here. It's a square intersection. There was this idea of a gateway. The Pantheon kept coming up. These are wigwams, which is the indigenous people who lived in this area originally, built these kinds of dome structures. And then even more locally, there are these gateway structures that were built for local fairs. And so we proposed this. We proposed this kind of tent-like structure. It's a very simple thing, right? Over the main intersection that could also be a place for parties at night, could be lit up with projections and so forth. And people got very excited by the idea. And so we started drawing it, and we had about 3 months for all of this. So we started drawing it and came up with the right details and so forth. And then it had to get built in about 6 weeks. And so we had to commission the steel, commission the fabric, and up it goes and up it goes. And then, of course, we realized that the intersection wasn't square. It was actually a rectangle, which threw us for a while. And it was actually this very interesting success story. There it is again. And so there you see it. I just got a picture from a local resident who sent me a picture of it in the snow. Because one of the things that happened is this was only supposed to be up until last month. But when we presented it to the community, they liked the idea so much. They said, we don't want it to be a temporary art exhibit. We want it for longer, which meant we had to redesign the steel to hold snow and to take a much larger load. And so we did that as quickly as we could. And so this is the opening night party. You see me and one of my studio colleagues, my Ruchi, our studio director, there. And someone arranged this extraordinary opening night party that had almost every ethnicity in the town, Japanese, Indian, Black, Latin American, do dance performances, and then this kind of extraordinary party that happened afterwards with kids that were allowed to wear colors. They didn't just have to have all white uniforms on. And they love this, and it's lit at night and so forth, and it's been a big success, and it's out there today. And it's been proof to me that a very small intervention can sometimes, and by the way, the most interesting thing about this is it's over an intersection that usually has cars. So this really freaked out the mayor, because the mayor's like, well, won't the businesses want cars? But the people wanted the space. And so now they're closing it more and more. And to me, it's a very important reminder of one of my heroes in architecture. Hopefully you've studied his work, a Dutch architect, Alde van Eyck. And he was an early modernist, but he had a different idea than Le Corbusier or Mies about architecture. He felt that what was really important about architecture was how it changed through the user experience, how users actually redefined what it means. So he said, whatever space and time means, space and time, Sigfrid Gideon, if you study that in architectural history, place and occasion mean more. In other words, how people use it changes the architecture itself in the idea of Van Eyck. And so I think we kind of witnessed that firsthand with this project. So next, at a larger scale, I want to talk about something that's also been a big piece of social connection. I've been working on this project for almost 10 years now, called the Domino Sugar Refinery in Brooklyn on the Williamsburg waterfront. This is a park that was located where an old factory was, and actually we visited the Kunsthalle today. It kind of reminded me a little bit. So this was an old sugar refinery. It has a complicated history with slavery because slave ships would come and bring sugar cane here. It was operating as a sugar refinery until 2004, and then the sugar refinery actually moved, and so this was shut down. And it actually, what's interesting is our local authorities designated it a heritage building, so it's a historic landmark, right? And yet there was this real question of what you could do with it, and it had 11 acres around it. And a colleague that we also did a lot of work with the High Line on, Lisa Switkin's a landscape architect, and I want to point this playground out. This playground is extremely important because the surrounding communities, there was a historic Jewish community, an African American community, a Latin American community, a kind of hipster community, and they never interacted very much. This playground is where all their kids play together. So they see all that social difference. So those diagrams I was showing you of those multicolored dots, that's this playground. It is the proof of this idea of positive social friction. So the park has been a big success. And now it's this question of what to do with the building. And the building is a challenge because it was built in 3 different parts. None of the windows line up. The idea for the building is to put a creative office building in it. And so there's just this whole question because the windows didn't line up, and that was okay because most of the facade is actually fake. It was there to house machinery as an envelope. And so this is what the inside of the building looked like. This is where they process sugar. So you'll see there were no real floors that lined up to the windows. And so when you don't have windows that line up, how do you strike a floor across it? You know, we have very, very strict wheelchair regulations in the United States, so you can't have lots of steps and so forth. And so we started this idea of thinking we could put a new building in the old building. So that's the new building on the left, and to the right you're seeing the inside of the historic fabric of the building. And so it was actually emulating the previous condition. And so then we had this, and the owner was very interested in this, and so then we built lots of models and said, you know, what shape should this be? We kept coming back to this basic idea that the building was built in something called the American round arch style. The arch windows is actually a fire protection device. You see these arch windows right here. That's to eliminate the wood lintel that held up the brick, and that actually kept it safe during fires, and we wanted to celebrate that history. And so this curved barrel vault form kept coming back, and so that's what we got approved through our local landmarks regulatory body. And so that's the gap today. That's what I showed you in the rendering. And there's actually 25 trees that are planted in that gap. And so when you're in the inside of the building, you're looking through a very modern curtain wall, right, that we've detailed. And you see then that barrel vault emerge from the exterior to form that new kind of skyline piece. And this has been, I think, very well accepted by the community, by local officials and so forth, as this very interesting tension between old and new. So remember what I talked about before, this notion that architecture is becoming so much the same. This can only be here. You can't take it and move it to Dubai or Shanghai. It won't make any sense. Right? And so that is this idea of the architecture actually helping people to understand their own community. So then staying with it, then I think, so I often, when I think about buildings, I think about how they meet the sky and how they meet the street. To me, those are the 2 most central components of a building. And so we just talked about how it met the sky, how it meets the street. So we've designed this beautiful park. We convinced the regulatory authorities to make all the windows in the building door height. So the building is much more porous, even though it's very muscular. And so you see that now. So this is just finishing construction in terms of how, so this will be all a public plaza with cafes and so forth. And then you see, by the way, the back of the building, which we don't think of as a back of the building. One of the challenges with a waterfront building sometimes is everyone is so focused on the water that we forget that there are communities on the other side. And so the entrance to the building is actually on the city side of the building, and you can see its location relative to the rest of the city. And then finally, the top of the building, which has become a great gathering place, a great place of social connection, and already there are events taking place there, and it's a really exciting space to be in. Okay, then the last architecture project I wanted to show you is in one of the poorest parts of New York City, in Brooklyn, but the other side of Brooklyn, East New York, where we're building this major housing project around a church. So our client here is actually the Reverend, the head of the church, and he has 11 acres of parking all around. Many people had approached him, and so we approached him with a builder and said, you know, you could build a civic heart. He's a very interesting man. He's read a lot of Jane Jacobs and other urbanists, and so for him, how the buildings met the ground were everything. So what's interesting about this project is it's 100% social housing. It's everything from housing for formerly homeless people. And understand that in New York City, we have a massive homelessness crisis. We have about 100,000 people living on the streets, including a lot of children. So there's transitional housing for the formerly homeless, and then all the way up to kind of working class housing, all surrounding not just this church, but a new performing arts center, as well as a lot of public space. And the Reverend had this idea that on the ground floor, he not only wanted stores, but also what he called social infrastructure. So for instance, 24/7 daycare, because a lot of the poorer residents had children, but they worked at night. And so they needed a place to drop off their kids at night. And so the ground floor is filled with those kinds of services. And so it all has this idea of this central quad that's the heart of the place. And so we're in the middle of designing. These are actually fairly raw drawings. These aren't professional renderings. These are just what we did in-house. But brick was very important to the local community. That was something that we heard again and again. A performing arts center that we're still in the middle of designing, and this will probably take some philanthropic dollars to complete. But this is not a part of town that gets performing arts centers. So that's about a 300-seat facility, because there are a lot of local arts groups. And then this idea of a complete street with very few cars on it, with a variety of scale of the building. The budget is very, very low. Unlike Domino, which I just showed you, which had a good, healthy budget, this is a very low budget, kind of because it's 100% affordable housing, but we still think it creates a very dignified environment for this community. So one of the things that we do in addition to this kind of work is we do a lot of research in the firm. And so, there it is. So we started looking at affordable housing and social housing as a research idea. And these towers that we build seem very problematic, and we were also very interested, and this actually came out of some work that TED asked us to do, the TED Talk series, about creating carbon negative housing. And so the thing that's interesting is we know that we can create a carbon negative single family home. In most sunny climates, you can put enough solar panels today using today's technology with batteries that you can offset most of the electricity use in that house. But the problem, of course, is the single family home. So it's still car dependent, it's sprawl and so forth. Towers, it's a much more difficult challenge in terms of creating carbon negativity. You can lower carbon usage, but right now there are all of these promising technologies, solar glass, mass timber, bioconcrete, but none of them are scalable technologies yet. And so we can lower the carbon emissions, and sometimes towers in a city like New York or a city like Hong Kong, when you have a lot of mass transportation and a lot of demand, it's still a good idea to build that kind of density. But in a lot of places it isn't, and it's very, very difficult, again, to make this truly green. And so we started thinking about, well, okay, so if the single family house isn't the model, and it's not the model because even if it's carbon negative, again, it relies on cars, there's a loss of wetlands and farming and forest, and again, that sense of social connection. You will never see, by the way, any kids playing in these backyards anymore. You'll only see them playing in the playgrounds because they want to play with friends. And so our question as a research question became, how do we think about a middle scale between these two? And does the carbon negative question bring us to a different kind of solution? And so we came up with this thing called Goldilocks. I don't know if you know the Goldilocks story, right? But it's the middle one, right? And so this is a scale and a density I'm sure you'll recognize, right? 3 to 4 stories. So why 3 to 4 stories? A couple of things. There's enough roof area for a housing project of that size to actually, again, accommodate all of the power needs in most sunny climates, right? It's also an interesting model because the international code, some of the local codes are different. The international code says at 3 stories, you don't have to have an elevator as long as the ground floor units are accessible by a wheelchair. So that lowers construction cost and makes it a much more affordable kind of construction. And so we found that there's this sweet spot, that there's enough roof area there in most places, probably throughout Europe, that you could accommodate the energy needs and actually produce a little bit more and give back to the grid than what the residents need, the inhabitants need. And what's interesting is this isn't a design, it's a prototype. So it could be built out of wood in some places, it might be built out of brick or stone. That's kind of less important, it's the model that matters. And so again, we think that with the right technology, and again, technology that exists today, it could give back to the grid. It could have heating and cooling systems, I'm sure many of you know about in terms of geothermal, heat pumps, and so forth. And that it could have all the composting and waste kind of treatment that is modern today, and also give gracious flats, gracious living units for people, including, again, on the ground floor for people in wheelchairs. So, you know, these are flats that are about 100 square meters. And what's interesting in this model is because you don't need an elevator, you can create one communal staircase in that model according to code, a single stair. And what's interesting is many of our older cities are built with that single stair density. And that single stair density has, again, this ability to create social connection because people, neighbors all see each other on that stairs, right? So we think that that can be integrated. If you look at where most available sites are in most major cities today, they tend not to be in the center of the city where a lot of development's already taken place. They tend to be a little bit like on the first ring or the second ring out from the city, still accessed by mass transportation, but where there's a parking lot, low-story retail. We think it can be very well integrated into those kinds of environments. And then, and I think this is very important in Prague, actually, that when you look at the amount of residents you can house on a lot, that you can start creating the courtyard model. And I think courtyards are something that, again, is a historic idea, a very important European idea especially, but you can find them throughout the world. Very, very good in terms of climate and hotter climates. And so you can combine that Goldilocks unit to create courtyard systems in places that I think need density, and this is quite dense actually, even at 3 stories, but not tower density. And then we close this research by showing how it could be deployed, how it can manifest in 2 different places that I know well, New York City, in this case in Queens, and in Calcutta, where I was born in India, Northeast India. And again, sites near mass transportation. So here you're seeing a brick courtyard development of that model. Here you're seeing a wood version of that model that's more of a kind of townhouse environment in New York. So that led to another piece of research. We have recently been doing a lot of work with the New York Times about how to create more affordable housing. And this just came out in the paper a few weeks ago, and a friend of mine texted me and said, "You've broken the internet," because it turns out a lot of people are very concerned about housing around the world. And so basically what the New York Times asked us to do is say, there's this huge housing debate in New York City. Housing is very unaffordable. We have homelessness, and we also have a very significant migrant crisis. I'm sure you've read about this. We have a lot of people coming over to the southern border, a lot of people coming to New York and other cities. New York City has about 8 million people in it, and people assume that the city's full, and a lot of neighbors and neighborhood groups push against new housing, because a lot of that new housing, again, comes in the form of these towers. So we said, well, what if you approach this question differently? What if you approach this question as, how could you build new housing throughout New York City, but in a way that kept neighborhood character? In other words, if you didn't change the basic scale, the look and feel of the city that people know, how much housing could you build? Turns out you can build a lot. So we had a couple of criteria. We said we only wanted to be close to mass transportation, right? Obviously, because we don't want to build auto development. And we wanted to stay out of the flood zones in New York. So those are our 2 big filters for finding land. And we found an extraordinary amount of land. We found about 1,700 acres, about 10,000 sites that were available for housing. That's twice the size of Central Park. It's an enormous amount of land. And so what's interesting, I go to a lot of cities, and people always think the city's full. But what it turns out is the city's actually got a lot of underutilized land. It has parking spaces and retail shops that are very low and so forth. And so what we did is we then looked at it in terms of different scales of height. So we used that Goldilocks model again. That was the low rise. And then a mid-rise that's about 5 to 15 stories, and that's a different kind of construction. And then 30 to 50 stories, which is contextual in parts of New York City, because we have a much taller city, obviously. But we didn't have super tall buildings that were over 50 stories, and we didn't have single-family houses in terms of what we were proposing. And then we went neighborhood by neighborhood, and we said, within about an 80-meter rate, no, sorry. Within about a 30-meter radius, we said, what's the tallest building? And we won't build taller. We won't propose anything taller than the tallest building in terms of establishing a height limit. And what we ended up with then is this idea that if you had a lot like that in a single-family neighborhood, you could build Goldilocks. You could build one of those 3-story units. If you had a single story kind of retail shop, but you had some apartment buildings that were taller around it, you could build a mid-scale. This is about a 58-unit residential building. Or in the taller, denser parts of the city, you could build that taller 30 to 50-story scale. And then finally, some of our older office buildings, we looked at, could you convert, because obviously with the pandemic, some of the office demand is down. Could you convert some of that to residential? It's very expensive. We looked at it on a case-by-case basis. It's difficult. And we came up with something rather extraordinary. So with this thing, one thing that we found very interesting in terms of converting office space, if you're interested in this, is creating communal workspace in the center of the building. We established the ability to build on those 10,000 sites 520,000 homes. That's enough to house 1.3 million people, which I think is the population of Prague, which is extraordinary for a city that thinks it's full. And we said we could do all of that while maintaining the character of the city. And what's interesting is after this article came out, and the New York Times did a wonderful job with the visualizations and so forth. After this article came out, I got a lot of emails and texts and so forth and things on social media from neighborhood groups that said, we'd like this idea. You know, we traditionally haven't liked that much new housing in our neighborhoods, but you know, if you can keep it in the scale of our neighborhood, all the developers hated it because they don't want to keep to the scale of the neighborhood. But anyway, it was a very interesting piece of research. I have a couple of more things like this that are research, but I'm also aware that because of technology, we've sort of hit time. Do you want me to keep going, or do you want to go to questions and answers? It's up to you.
So yeah, maybe we do.
Okay,
maybe a little intermezzo
I think you get the idea.
of questions and answers now. I just got a question about the open green spaces, how you incorporate them into thinking about the densification of cities, and what's the relationship between them, if you can talk about it a little bit more.
A lot of planners do that through quantity. They say if you have this many housing units, you need this much square footage of open space. I don't think that works very well because it's about quality as much as it is about quantity. And so you'll see in a lot of those diagrams, it's about the open space that gets formed, formed by the buildings.
Yeah.
So when you took the Goldilocks and made the courtyard, right? So you have to not just look at the quantity, but how do you create, and again, you have examples all over Prague and all over most European cities of creating these outdoor rooms. And I think what's so important about that is the spatial sequence or the hierarchy. So sometimes you will go out into a courtyard and it's really for the building, right? And so you see your neighbors. If you have an elderly neighbor and you haven't seen her for a while, you might wonder what happened to her, right? So there's a different form of social connection. And then that leads to a neighborhood park. And then that can lead to a city park. And so I think those sequences, and again, I'm not trying to be a historicist about this. I think that there's a way to do all of that with modern architecture and with a different idea for the 21st century. But I do think that that form of the city is something that we seem to have forgotten in our haste to build international style towers and so forth.
I agree, and sorry for the...
Oh, this is another, I'll just explain very quickly what that was. Now it's gone away. The other two things I was going to show you very quickly was we did two other projects with the New York Times like this. One was where we said, imagine Manhattan if you eliminated private automobiles. So you'd still have shared automobiles, you'd still have freight delivery, and this was not a technology question, it was a spatial question. It was about how much space you could recover in the city, right? If you took away most of those private cars and had a completely different environment, right? How much more space you had for pedestrians, for bikes, and so forth. And this has actually impacted some things around policy. We're adopting a congestion pricing policy like London and Stockholm. And what I hope someday is we build a tram system like what you have by eliminating most of the private cars and having much more surface transportation in the city. And then I won't go through this in detail because it's just too long a story, but our train station is really horrible. It is a joyless place, and it has a big sports arena on top. And this is something we proposed, that if the sports arena moved, we could recycle the sports arena building and reclad it and make it into our new train station. And now we're working on this project for real, actually. But I'm going to leave it there just so we can go back to the discussion. But it's a nice backdrop, I think.
So are you talking about the Madison Square Garden?
Yes. So this was the idea that if the garden never moved, that's the sports arena, that we could recycle the building and turn it into a train station. All right, I'll just do it. I can't resist. I can't. So then, actually, my current client on this was inspired by that work. That work was from 4 years ago. And he then hired us to look at, the garden isn't moving. So this is the wonderful architecture building that is both our sports arena and our main train station. And he hired us to reclad it and rethink about the entire thing, from the tracks up all the way to the sidewalk to a new facade, and rethink the entire superblock. So we're in the middle of working with our government right now to see if we can make that happen, including changing the experience underneath and all around. So that's typical of, that's one of the nicer spaces in the train station. So that's what we're working on right now, actually. There.
That is super interesting, especially from somebody who loves New York. Who's been to New York from the audience? Can I just see? Oh, quite a bunch. So you definitely have seen Madison Square Garden, which is also the most famous concert venue. And
yes, and inside, and if you're there and you're with Taylor Swift, great. But the outside and the rest of it is just, it's painful.
It's true, it's terrible, and I always wonder how much of the stuff is happening around it and under it and in it, but you have no clue, kind of, and also no way how to move around, and you just really don't understand how actually it all came together.
This site is layers of history. The original building was a very famous building that got torn down in 1963, and actually that was the trigger for the United States landmarks laws. So when I showed you Domino and I said it was a heritage building, the legal function of that comes from the fact that the original train station was torn down here. So there's layers of history. It's a very complex, interesting urban story.
Okay. Thank you very much for the lecture. Let's end it officially, the lecture here.
Yes, let's end the lecture.
Thank you for the patience with the screen. We have amazing 4K new projectors, which are really sharp. I'm really amazed how sharp they are, but we still need to work on them, apparently. So thank you very much. It was really a pleasure. And now let's get.
Thank you.
Now let's get to the questions. I'll have first one, and then we can start. We have microphones and guys who hold the microphone. So whoever then wants to have a question, you just raise your hand, and we'll give you the microphone. But first, you talked a lot about research, and I know that you do the research yourself, like in PAU. how it went, how it happened that you actually decided to do research, how you fund it, and how big it is, and how it works together with the practice of designing as well. Because I think it's quite unique, especially in Czech context. We really don't do that.
Yeah, it's fairly unique in the United States too, because it's largely a money-losing proposition. You know, we fund it all through our, you know, our profit-making work that I showed you, and we have some very, very intelligent people who not only are architects but have very strong analytical skills, and so they can do the kind of like the work I showed you about housing and where the housing capacity is. There are 3 or 4 people in our office who are both architects and urban planners. I should also mention, you should raise your hand. This is someone from our office, one of our few remote employees, a Ukrainian architect who is working from Vienna, and she came to Prague for the lecture, which is very nice. So we have these excellent people who work in our office, and they're interested in more than architecture. And what, you know, I want to be careful when I say that, because we all love architecture. We love trying to create beautiful things that serve our clients. And the hard work of the details, like in Domino, I showed that detail sheet. You know, it's just, architecture is hard work, and that's a part of what we have to do. But they're all socially very passionate people, and they want to do more, and they have the ability to do more. And because I have this very strange background of having worked for the city and other things, people do come to us with these questions. And so we feel that as architects, we can offer society something that economists or technologists can't, which is we can help people visualize things that don't exist, right? And that's a very powerful thing. Like this housing debate has been a debate in New York City for as long as I can remember, for 30 years. But for people to see it visually and easily, and if you go to the Times website and you look at the article, it's a short article, and the Times did a beautiful job, very fluid job with the visualizations. So they're passion projects for us, and so we do them when we can. We do them when we're asked an important question. The other thing is, I mean, and just to be completely honest about it, the New York Times is enormous. It has an enormous worldwide circulation. So it also gives us a lot of exposure in the world and kind of positions us as a firm that is, like, I know you have Bjarke coming next week, and he's a friend. I like him. I respect what he's done. It's a very different kind of firm. And so I think it's very important as architects, as urbanists, to kind of stake out a position. I mean, what's distinct? You know, if you're going to start a firm or you're going to start a firm, what are you going to tell people is why someone is coming to your office and hiring you? Because you're better than the person down the street? That's a terrible argument, right? This terrible, terrible argument, right? You stand for something, and then suddenly you find out that you get people coming to you who believe in the things that you do, and you don't get the people coming to you who want to do something different.
That brings me to the role of investors and city administration within your projects and projects of architecture and urbanism in general. How is the situation in New York? Are you used to having all of the clients enlightened and they want to, there's like, oop, how does these like social aware projects and environmentally friendly will go to them? Or do you find most of your explaining and pushing and can you elaborate on that?
It's a lot of explaining and pushing. We have I mean, obviously, I think you all know that New York and the United States, you know, in 2024, we live in a deeply, deeply capitalist country. And, you know, look, PAU is a business, so we are operating in a capitalist context. I don't deny that. But developers are, I mean, very unique and rare. And so we don't work with most of them. And we're not doing any luxury housing, for instance. And so that makes it very difficult to kind of like pay bills sometimes and things like that. But we then get that social housing project that I showed in East New York. And that's an important long-term project for us. And so, look, part of this question for us is we try to keep at a scale of about 25 to 30 people, which is about 24 architects and some interns. We pay our interns, all right? We pay everyone. Everyone has the good benefits and so forth. It's very important. If you get big, right? You by definition, you get less selective about the work you can take. It's just, you can't do what we're doing and have hundreds of people or thousands of people, because you have to take luxury housing, and you have to take prisons, and you have to take work in Saudi Arabia, and you have to do all of those things because you can't make the business work otherwise. So that question about scale is very, very important. I mean, if you're doing residential work, you can keep to quite a small scale. If you're trying to do things like this, you can't do a small scale, but you can do it with 25 or 30 very good people. And so that is a big part of the question you're asking.
Thank you very much. Now I open the discussion to you. Is there anyone who has a question already? There's one. Wait till you get the microphone, please.
Yeah, hello, thank you for a very nice lecture. I would be interested in this project you showed us with the residential project. I would be interested if it was self-initiated or is it in relation with the government somehow?
I didn't hear the last part. Is it what?
Yeah, if is it self-initiated because there's a lot of work, or is it
so
because you see this
which
one?
Housing project?
I mean the one which was published in New York Times, the one about the scale of the residential houses.
It's largely self-initiated. I mean, it's initiated in part by the New York Times. The New York Times called us several months ago now, probably about 5 months ago, and said, there's this housing debate, it's not going away, people don't want new housing in their neighborhoods. Can you help us? Because we have this established relationship from the work we did on Penn Station and this thing about a car-free Manhattan. And so we started looking at it and established this criteria. So it was very self-initiated. The government had an interesting response. The government, I think, our leadership does want to build, our mayor and our governor do want to build more housing. So they liked it, but they wanted to be able to say that what we were proposing is exactly what they were proposing, which isn't really the case, but we're trying to be supportive of each other. Because I worked in government, I have a lot of sympathy. It's a hard job, and so, but the short answer is yes, it's self-initiated. We weren't paid anything for the work. We just did the work because we wanted to do.
Yeah, I would be curious because you said that it made lots of debate after it was published. So how is it gonna get further? Like, is there any further development of the project or? Yeah,
we're getting a lot of questions about that. Because as I said, we've uncovered 10,000 sites, but they're small scale sites that the developers typically aren't that interested in. There are some smaller community builders and so forth that have called and wanted to ask questions, some neighborhood groups, some academic, some universities have been interested in the database. Some technology companies have been interested in the database, which is kind of interesting. We would love to do another step in the work to really understand at a more granular level these 10,000 sites and what it would take to build the housing. So we're trying to figure that out in terms of how can we get a grant or somehow get funding to do that next step of work.
So thank you for your answer, and wishing you good luck with that.
Thanks.
I can imagine it's super complicated.
Yeah, it's super complicated.
And time-consuming. Who's next? Any more questions? There.
Hello. So you just mentioned how you were scouting for the locations. Can you maybe expand on that? Like, what was the process? around it? Because, as you said, a lot of tech companies and other companies are interested in it as well. So I guess many people are interested in here too. So,
and if you look at the article, at the bottom of the article, there's a methodology website that explains a little bit more about the data we used. And so there are city databases that talk about these sites. So we were it took us about 4 months to go through those databases to establish the 10,000 sites. Because some sites were small and didn't work, and so there are things like that that we had to filter out. I'm glad we did this instead of a developer or a technology company. I mean, to me, like an interesting extension of your question was this question I have about, is this architecture? And some architects have said, no, it's not. It's something else. It's community development, it's urban planning. But what I find strange about that answer is I can reverse the question and say, if an architecture firm didn't do this, who would? Mm-hmm. Because it takes a kind of broad range of skills, including visual skills. I mean, we thought those housing projects those are concept designs, obviously, but they looked reasonable, and that was important. They fit into their site in some way that was credible, and that was important. And I'm also, if you look at early modernist history coming out of both world wars, this is what architects weren't just doing architecture. In Germany, you had the whole tradition of the Siedlungs. There's just this whole tradition that we forget about sometimes, where architects were deeply involved in these questions, these big societal questions. And they're the same architects that we study in school. Korb, Tange, the Smithsons. Every single one of them published at different points treatises about housing and the city and so forth. And some of them had terrible ideas, especially Korb, right? But the thing is, though, it's really important to understand that tradition. And so I'm glad we were able to do that work with the database in a way that I don't think a tech company or a government or a developer or a straight urban planner would have done.
Thank you.
That leads me a little bit to a shorter question. What is the role of an architect in the society today?
Oh, that's a very short question. I don't know the exact answer to that question, and I don't think there's one answer. Mm. Again, I think we need as a profession. So here's my, I hear from a lot of architects, I've been hearing since I was in school, it's so hard being an architect. People don't respect us. We don't get paid well, And some of those things are true, and they're problems. But here's the thing. How can we expect society to treat us as relevant if we're not focused on relevant things? Right? And so this is a big challenge. So you think about, again, I don't know what the situation is here, but
sounds about the same. Continue.
Well, so in New York, for instance, so again, big commercial city, and I often hear architects say, oh, this place, it's controlled by lawyers and developers and bureaucrats and government bureaucrats, and no one listens to the architects. I think people will listen to the architects if the architects are saying things that are relevant to the people who are asking the questions. That to me is the fundamental thing that we have to reach. Now, how you're relevant depends on what your passion is. If your passion is sustainability, then that's a path, and you can think about that. If your passion is housing, that's another path. Some architects are very interested in things like mobility. So, I think I'm not saying that you have to have my position, but I'm saying have a position that matters to the world, right? And that, by the way, doesn't mean that you don't care about how, this wall surface meets that screen. That's the work of architecture. You still have to know those things, and how the building's held up and how the toilets work and all of that. It's hard. It's very difficult. But that's the challenge that I think we have as a profession in terms of gaining relevance. And part of why I started with that catastrophic series of green slides about climate inequity and technology is that's the context. And so I fundamentally believe that if you think about these big challenges, that we do hear lawyers and technologists talk about solutions to these things or ways to approach these issues. And yet, every one of those challenges, from climate to inequity, to technology, to public health, to population growth, all center on how we live, I would argue. Right? They all center on the decisions we make as a society about how we live. And so what we do as architects and urbanists and landscape architects, I would argue, are the most relevant and the most critical things to the big issues of the day. But we have to make sure we're framing the questions in a way that people understand, in a way that relates to people's lives.
And the context of the current situation, 100%. Any other questions?
Hi, Vishaan. I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation.
Sure.
It's actually the first time I got to listen to you speak, so this was a wonderful presentation. So one of the questions I wanted to ask was around the repurposing of the surface level parking around that church. One of the big questions I have is I know that you are working on the architectural side, but when it comes to implementation in a place like New York City, what does it look like when it comes to repurposing that land and getting the approval for rezoning it? Is it a really complex process? And how many times, you know, maybe a percentage of the time when you're planning to build something new, how much does that stunt or stop that from being realized?
It's such a painful answer. That project, which is incredibly popular in the community, it's 100% social housing. Took 5 years to get government approval, right? For a project that virtually everyone supported. And that's crazy, right? And it does stop projects like that from happening because, going back to your question about enlightened clients, that's an enlightened client. They're trying to do the right thing. But if you have to go through 5 years of lawyers and drawings and, you know, it's very expensive. Right? And so that's something that we need to reform. And then the parking thing, parking is the bane of my existence. Parking is going to kill me. I'm going to get, you know, I'm going to be cremated in a parking spot. I know it. Because it's just so as soon as you leave the center of our cities, and I mean the exact center, all you ever have to deal with is parking. Because as soon as someone's 3 blocks from the center, they want to know where they're going to park their stupid car. It amazes me, right? And so we're constantly struggling to figure out parking. The developers don't even want to build parking garages. It's expensive. They don't make any money off of it. It's stupid. But people are so married to their cars. And this, I think, is an enormous opportunity for your generation, right? You know, we have 2 kids. Neither of them have any interest in owning a driver's license or having a car. You know, they're New Yorkers. They grew up in New York City, right? And like I said, we walked all 57 neighborhoods today, I think. I mean, you live in a very walkable city. And so you have to challenge this premise of why people need their cars. And again, electric cars are not the solution. The whole point we tried to do with, like, cars take up in a city, I'm not talking about in a rural area where obviously you need cars, but in a city, they take up an enormous amount of physical space, right? And the space that they need is getting more and more because of safety standards and so forth. And so this is up to your generation. Like, we screwed this up. You know, and the generations before us screwed this up. And it's really up to you guys to figure out how we do this differently, because it is like so painful. It's extraordinary.
It is physically painful. I was working in the Office of Public Space in Prague for 7 years, and parking is really an issue that's just it's literally hurting. But we can talk about that later because we could be here forever.
Yes.
Very relevant answer. Any other questions? We still have 10 minutes there in the front row. Keep your hand up. Yes.
Thank you very much for the lecture, and thank you for making the world a better place. I think you are making such an important job. I wonder if you have a vision. I wonder what is your vision, and I wonder when did you find your vision, and what is your opinion on this pressure that maybe I or other young architects may feel, that we should succeed when we are young. So I wonder if you found your vision when you were younger in school, and if that is what made you successful, or when do you think we should find our vision?
Thank you for the question. That's a very hard question, but I will try. I think there's too much pressure on young people to try to know exactly who they want to be and have the vision you're talking about. I think it takes a lot of time, in the sense that, again, what I just tried to lay out is a very difficult thing. To understand everything that's in that ceiling and how it gets coordinated, at the same time that you're trying to think about these broader social issues, right? And I sense that struggle in a lot of young architects when I teach, when I talk to the people who work in our office. There's this constant struggle between the everyday work of being an architect and understanding that work, and then understanding how it applies to a larger context. So I'm a total weirdo when it comes to architecture, in the sense that I came to it quite late. You know, I had Indian immigrant parents, and you were allowed to be a doctor or an engineer, maybe a lawyer. You know, architect was kind of out of the question. And so I studied engineering, and I was a terrible engineering student. Then I switched to art. Then I studied urbanism, and then I finally studied architecture late in life. And I'm glad of having those experiences, and also of having a very nonlinear career. So, you know, many architects, you know, there's a tradition in architecture that, like, it's like joining a monastery, right? You come out of the monastery, and you're, I don't know, you're not supposed to speak, and you're celibate or whatever, and then you know, over time you do a small kitchen, and then maybe you get a retail store, and then maybe you get a house, and then maybe someone gives you a bigger commission, and someone notices you in a magazine or on Instagram, and then, you know, your career explodes. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that path. People follow that path, and it's a tried and true path. It's not at all my path. I ended up doing a lot of different things in my life. I was working as an architect. 9/11 happened. I went to work for the city. I went to work on this thing with Penn Station. I taught for a long time. I wrote a book. Writing, for me, helps me understand what a vision might be. And I think in the end of all of that journey, you have to end up being true to yourself. And so I've been telling, so why was I in Prague in 1985? Because you know, my crazy scientist father and my crazy musician mother, we traveled. And we didn't have a lot of money, but we saw cities. So sorry, my parents passed away, so I always get a little emotional. So cities were always the core. And so that's the basis for the vision.
Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry.
So with an easier question.
Thank you.
From Slido. How would you reshape mindset of people who perceive living in single houses in low-density suburban areas as the ultimate goal?
I wouldn't try to change their mindset. What I would try to do is change every subsidy that we make to make that housing cheap.
and so appealing, I guess.
So look, one of the big differences in Europe versus the United States is you have very high gasoline taxes here. Energy is a huge issue here, yes. In the United States, almost every policy decision that's made, right, has to do with keeping energy prices down and keeping gas prices down. Because what happens? As soon as gas prices go up, or we try to do anything to keep that lifestyle, tax that lifestyle according to the pollution and the congestion that it causes, that elected person will get kicked out of office, right? And so, and look, there are two sides to this. So you remember the yellow vest protests in France? A lot of it was about this, right? So that you had working class people who were getting very high taxes on the gasoline, and then you had a mayor who was very pro-bicycle and pro-walking, and was trying to keep cars from coming into the city. And a lot of middle class and workers were getting, had to drive in the city because the city's so expensive. And so it started, there are more reasons, but that was part of the Yellow Vest protest, right? And so this is a challenging thing. But the problem is, after World War II, there was a very profitable idea for a lot of corporations to say, let's make gas cheap, let's make heating and cooling of single-family houses cheap, let's make land cheap, right? Let's make free highways. So there's like an interesting question. You ride the tram, you pay a fare, but highways should be free. Like, this is very much an idea for older generations, right? And so if you charge people what it actually costs to live in a single family house, and they still want to pay all of that, that's up to them. I'm not going to tell them how to live. But we've artificially subsidized that lifestyle. And I think that's what has to change. And I think Europe is way ahead of the United States in terms of this, right? Because it does tax a lot of those things, but it's still a deep problem.
Yeah, and like in Czech Republic and the post-communist countries, it is quite different, and it's more focused on the private ownership and the land and the living in like secure private land and gardens.
Can I ask a question? Is that in the post-communist countries because it's a kind of backlash from communism?
Probably partly. Like, I have no data about that. I don't know if somebody is pro in this social issue, but I think part of it is definitely in the culture as well, like being private and having gardens and houses is something that's appealing, even because a lot of these premises around Prague are more expensive sometimes than actually living in Prague, and people still want to do that. So there is something appealing about that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
One more question about developers. This person thanks you for your presentation. And if developers aren't interested in smaller scale projects, what can be done to normalize these projects? Because I think it's relatable to what we said before.
So I think this again depends on the country. I don't know what the situation is in. Well, maybe things in Prague are actually more like in America. In the UK or in France, the government can still build housing. It's not just developers. In the US, it's actually illegal for the government to build housing. Mm-hmm. They can subsidize housing, but they can't build it. And so it's all up to developers. And so I just want to be clear about when I said that the developers don't want to build a smaller scale, that's usually the very big developers. And to be fair to them, it's because they've created these gigantic machines that are there to build gigantic things. And so it's very inefficient. But there are smaller scale developers. There are also community development corporations this isn't as true anymore, but in the 1980s and 1990s, there were things like churches that could form a development company and build an affordable housing project that was quite small scale. So I think we need to find other models, non-governmental models that are nonprofits. And there are people I know who've studied architecture and urban planning who've gone on and to do things like that. So I think there are other models for doing it.
Yeah, that's true. And we are, like, it's now in Czech Republic also at the beginning, let's say, reintroduce some of these models back into the society, because we also haven't been really doing it. And we have a kind of brand new, a few years, a city developer who's now preparing projects to build city housing again after 30 years of not doing that. And another question, we have still a couple of minutes because it's going well, so we can be a little bit longer. Someone else there?
Wisdom you shared, and maybe to follow up on one of the topics with the parking lots. How is it with the parking lots underground for the US overall? Is it a common thing or not at all?
They're very expensive, so we do build them. We tend to build them in, very expensive cities where the development can afford to build that. So you see them in New York and San Francisco and Boston. But as soon as you get out of the center of the city, it stops making any economic sense. So that's when the challenge emerges, because like that East New York project, the one I showed and outside of Brooklyn, there's a parking structure, and we're trying to make it a nice parking structure because we can't, there's a little bit of underground parking, but not very much, not enough for what the site needs.
Thank you.
Again, I want to kill myself over parking every day. So.
Someone else? No? No one. So I'll ask the final question, because I worked for the city for nearly 8 years, so I understand the position of being an architect within the city administration, trying to push for change and changing status quo. And I wonder, and I think it's still not popular enough among architects in here to go to work for the public sector. Most people just go to private companies or they establish their own studios. And I wonder how did this experience shaped you and your practice now that you have in your private studio? Would you be the same architect with the same vision, not working for the city?
No, it was an enormously important part of my career. First of all, I worked in a great administration. I think you've had Jeanette Sadek-Khan lecture here, right? So she was the transportation commissioner, the guerrilla transportation commissioner, biker extraordinaire, who also worked in the Bloomberg administration. And my boss was a woman named Amanda Burden, who was the chair of the City Planning Commission. So my responsibility was Manhattan. Her responsibility was the entire city. So we had extraordinary people. And remember, it was a time of crisis, right? It was right after 9/11. And actually, it reminds me very much of this post-pandemic moment where, again, all the articles come out about, oh, cities are dead, no one's going back to cities. It's like such boring news. But no, I worked for the city for about 4 years. I think it was completely transformative because you learn much more about the context of how everything works. We also had a very proactive city government, so we did the High Line and we did East River Waterfront and all of these things where we said that the way the city was going to recover from 9/11 was we were going to build great places, great public places, and that would drive the growth and reemergence of the city, and it did. And it created gentrification on the other side, but that's a longer story.
That's true. Thank you very much for a really great evening, great lecture, and great public spaces in New York. I must say the way how New York works, with especially the waterfronts, is really amazing to see. And every time I go there, there's more, and the parks are really diverse and inclusive and fun to be in. And I think very inspirational. Sometimes a little bit overprogrammed, but
yeah, that's the landscape architect. Yeah, that's not us.
But otherwise, it's really great places to take inspiration from as architects and landscape architects. So I recommend everybody to go. And thank you very much for your lecture. It was really inspiring to hear you.
Thank you.
And thank you as well for coming, for seeing us online, and I hope to see you in camp soon again. Have a nice evening.